The smell reached me before the thought did. Bitter almond, hiding under rosewater, wrong in a way my body understood before my mind caught up. I had a tray balanced on my left palm and a wine list memorized in my right hand, and none of that mattered anymore, because the glass at table 9 was lying to everyone in this room, and I was the only person who could hear it. Table 9 sat the Castellan widow. I did not know that name yet, not with the weight it would come to carry. I only knew the woman drinking there was the reason the entire dining room at the Amaranth had gone quiet and careful 3 hours ago, the reason the manager kept touching his collar, the reason 2 men stood by the exits with their hands folded and their eyes never still. I knew her glass had been poured from a bottle brought up personally by the sommelier, uncorked at the table, watched the whole time. I knew that should have made it safe. I knew, from 4 years of a life I had abandoned and never quite put down, exactly what almond under rosewater meant in a wine that had no business smelling like either. My hands did not shake. That was the strange part, the part I would turn over for months afterward. 6 years of being invisible had trained my hands to be steady no matter what my chest was doing, and my chest, right then, was doing a great deal. I set my tray down at the service station. I lifted a fresh glass from the rack. I walked to table 9 the way I walked everywhere in that restaurant, which is to say the way water finds a drain, without announcing itself, without asking permission to exist in a room. I switched the glasses in silence. No one saw it happen, because no one ever saw me happen. That had been true since I was 19 years old, refilling water glasses at my mother's bedside instead of sitting for exams I had already paid for. And it was true 4 years later in a dining room that charged more for an appetizer than I made in a shift. I was the girl the regulars called quiet, the girl the kitchen called the ghost, the girl who had once been told by the maître d', in front of a full room, that I should smile more if I wanted anyone to remember I existed. I had smiled less after that. It had not made me disappear any faster than I already was. My name is Rue Calloway. I was 26 years old. I had $211 in a checking account that no longer had anyone to protect, and I had spent 3 years of a pharmacy degree learning to read poison the way other people read weather, before my mother's illness spent every dollar meant to finish it. I left school with a transcript full of incompletes and a nose that never forgot a compound once it had met it. I told myself that knowledge was useless now. I told myself a great many things in those years that turned out not to be true. The poisoned glass sat on my tray, evidence and confession in one, and I did not know yet what I was going to do with it. I only knew I could not set it down where anyone might drink from it by accident, and I could not walk away from a table where a woman was about to die of something with a name I still remembered from a lecture hall 3 winters gone. I looked up, and she was already looking at me. The Castellan widow. I had heard the name whispered by the hostess stand 100 times without ever matching it to the woman it belonged to, because no one had ever pointed and said, "That one, be careful of that one." She did not need to be pointed at. She sat with the stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing to move to be obeyed. Black hair pulled back hard enough to show a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the tables, and a scent that reached me even from 4 feet away, cedar gone black at the edges, and the smoke of a match just struck and dropped. Cold, deliberate, the kind of cold that had learned, a long time ago, to be mistaken for calm. Her eyes went from my face to the tray, to the second glass sitting where the first had been, to my hands, which had not shaken once through any of it. Something in her stillness sharpened. "You changed my wine," she said. Not a question. She did not ask questions when a statement would do more work. Yes, my voice came out steadier than I expected. It wasn't safe to drink. The dining room kept talking around us, forks and low laughter and the clink of someone's dessert being cleared, entirely unaware that the air at table 9 had just gone still in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The man across from her, an older man with a wine-red tie and a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes, set down his own glass with a care that struck me, even then, as 1 degree too careful. "Explain," she said. I told her. "Bitter almond under rose water. A masking agent, something floral and cheap, layered over a compound that should never share a glass with Pinot Noir." I told her the timing mattered, that whatever it was had likely gone in during the pour, not before, because the cork had still been sealed when it reached the table, and I had watched the sommelier open it myself. I told her all of this in the flat, quick cadence of someone reciting something she had once been tested on and never forgotten, and the whole time her eyes did not leave my face, not once, not even to check the glass I had swapped it for. "Who are you?" she said, when I finished, still not a question. A demand, wrapped so tightly in calm that it took me a moment to hear the demand underneath it. "Nobody," I said, because it was the truest word I had. "I just work here." Her gaze held mine a second longer than any stranger's gaze had held mine in years, and something moved behind it that I would not have a name for until much later. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular hunger of a woman who has spent a long time being surrounded by people and utterly alone inside it. "Nobody doesn't smell poison in a crowded room," she said, and rose from her chair in one motion, the man in the wine-red tie already half out of his own seat with a protest dying on his lips. "Finish your shift. Then, you and I are going to talk." She walked away before I could answer, taking the untouched glass with her, and I stood there holding a tray with nothing on it, and a heartbeat that had finally, 4 minutes too late, begun to shake. I did not finish my shift so much as survive the remainder of it. Every table I served, every plate I carried, I felt her absence from the dining room, like a held breath, and I kept turning over the 2 things I now knew for certain. Someone in that room had wanted the Castellan widow dead badly enough to poison her at her own table, in front of her own men, in a restaurant where every employee had been vetted twice, and I had just made myself the one person alive who could prove it. Nadia found me in the back hallway near closing, untying her apron with the particular violence she reserved for slow nights and bad tips. She took one look at my face and stopped. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. "I might have caused one," I said, and did not explain further, because right then the kitchen door swung open, and one of the men who had stood silent by the exits all night stepped through it, looking directly at me. "She's ready for you," he said. Now, Nadia's mouth fell open. I set down the rag I had been folding, wiped my palms once against my apron out of habit, and followed him toward the private room at the back of the Amaranth, where the Castellan widow was waiting to find out exactly who I was. The private room smelled like her before I ever crossed the threshold, cedar and struck match, filling the space the way weather fills a valley, impossible to stand outside of once you were in range of it. She sat at the head of a long table with the poisoned glass placed in front of her like evidence at a trial, and the man with the wine-red tie was nowhere in sight. Only the gruff-looking man who had escorted me stood near the door, arms crossed, watching me with the particular suspicion of someone who trusted no one who had not been tested first. "Sit," she said, not unkind, not warm either. I sat. "Bram tells me you have no family here," she said, "no siblings, a mother who passed 11 months ago. 3 years of a pharmacy degree you never finished." She had learned all of this in the time it took me to walk down one hallway, and the fact of it should have frightened me more than it did. Tell me how a waitress knows what oleander concentrate smells like under rosewater. Because for 3 years I studied how to save people from exactly that, I said. And then I stopped being able to afford it. Something in her face did not soften exactly, but it stilled further, the way still water stills further when the wind finally, truly drops. I don't believe in luck, she said. I believe someone in my organization tried to kill me tonight, and a woman no one bothered to learn the name of is the only reason it didn't work. She studied me the way I imagined she studied ledgers, looking for the number that did not add up. What is your name? Rue, she repeated, and something about the way she said it made it sound like she was testing its weight, deciding whether to keep it. I'm Thea Castellan. As of tonight, Rue, you don't go home alone, and you don't go home unwatched. Someone at that table wanted a body in a chair, and it is not going to be mine, and it is not going to be yours either, not after what you did for me. She rose, and the room seemed to rise with her, every man near the walls straightening at once. Get your things. You're coming with me. I should have argued. I would spend the next 10 days telling myself I should have argued, should have said something about a life that was small and quiet and mine, about rent already paid and a cat that needed feeding and a version of safety I had built entirely out of never being noticed. But she was already at the door, already the kind of certain that did not leave room for other people's plans, and beneath the fear climbing up through my ribs was something else. Something I did not want to name yet, curling low and warm at the base of my throat. Someone had finally, after 6 years of being furniture in every room I entered, looked directly at me and seen something worth protecting. I got my things. I went with her. And the door of the Amaranth closed behind me on the only life I had known how to be safe in, into a car that smelled like cedar and cold rain, and the particular silence of a woman deciding, in real time, exactly how much of herself she was willing to risk on a stranger who had just saved her life. The car took the long way through the city, past streetlights blurred gold in a light rain that had started sometime during dinner without my noticing, and Thea Castellan sat across from me, with her hands folded, and her eyes on the window, saying nothing for 11 full minutes. I counted them. Counting had always been a habit of mine in rooms where I didn't know the rules, counting exits, counting seconds, counting anything that would sit still long enough to be counted. You're doing it again, she said, without turning her head. Doing what? Counting something. I can hear it in how you're breathing. I did not ask how she knew that, because I suspected the answer was the same reason she had risen from her chair the instant I set down a second glass. A woman who had survived as long as she had by reading rooms the way I read compounds, fast and without mercy for her own comfort. Seconds, I admitted. I count seconds when I'm nervous. Don't be nervous, she said, which was not comfort so much as instruction, and yet something in the low register of her voice made my shoulders drop half an inch anyway. Whoever poured that wine wanted a dead woman on the front page tomorrow. They didn't get one. That makes you the safest person in this city tonight, because I am not in the habit of losing what belongs to me. I don't belong to you, I said, before I could stop myself. For the first time since I had met her, something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of her mouth, there and gone in less time than it took to notice. No, she agreed. Not yet. And she turned back to the window and left me to sit with a sentence that should have terrified me, and instead settled somewhere warm and unfamiliar behind my ribs, all the way to the tall iron gates of a house I did not yet know I would come to think of as home. The house rose out of the dark like something that had never once doubted it deserved the space it took up. 3 stories of pale stone behind a wall high enough to swallow the streetlight, a fountain gone silent for the season, windows lit gold on the ground floor and dark everywhere else. Bram parked the car in a garage that held 4 others worth more than every apartment I had ever lived in combined, and I stood on the gravel a moment too long, doing the math on how far I was now from $211 and a studio with a leaking tap. "This way," Thea said, already moving, and I followed her the way I had followed her out of the Amaranth. Because some doors only open once, and I had learned, watching my mother's hospital bills climb past every number I understood, that survival rarely waited for you to feel ready. Inside, the house was quieter than I expected wealth to be. No gilt, no marble excess, just dark wood and low lamps and the particular hush of a place built for people who valued not being overheard. A woman with silver-streaked hair and flour still dusting one forearm met us in the hall, took one look at me, and disappeared without a word toward the kitchen. She returned 4 minutes later with a plate of bread and soft cheese and a look that dared me to refuse it. "Marta feeds everyone, whether they're hungry or not," Thea said, something almost fond threading through the flatness of her voice. "Eat, you'll need it. Bram is going to want to search your bag, and you're going to let him, and then someone will show you a room." "Search my bag," I repeated. "Someone tried to kill me 2 hours ago," she said, and the fondness was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold, exact calculation I would learn was her default weather. "I don't extend trust. I extend proof of trust. Over time, you've earned the first inch of it. The rest you'll have to earn the way everyone does." I let Bram search my bag. He found a phone with a cracked screen, $40 in loose bills, and a small dented tin that had once held mints and now held dried chamomile, a sprig of rue, and a few curls of dried orange peel, all of it crushed soft from years in my pocket. He turned it over once, opened the lid, frowned at the smell, and closed it again without comment, setting it gently back in my bag instead of confiscating it, which was the first small kindness anyone in that house showed me. "My mother's," I said before he could ask, because his eyes had lingered a half-second too long. "She used to make tea from it." I never got rid of the tin. Something shifted in his face, brief and unreadable, gone before I could name it. "Room's upstairs," he said instead. "3rd. Door. Don't wander the halls after 10. Some of us shoot first." He was not entirely joking. The room they gave me was larger than my entire apartment, a bed with more pillows than I owned dish towels. A window overlooking a garden gone dark and wild at the edges where the groundskeepers had clearly stopped bothering. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving, the little tin in my lap, and thought about the fact that 6 hours ago I had been refilling water glasses and being called the ghost by a kitchen full of men who barely remembered my name. And now I was sleeping under the roof of a woman the whole city apparently feared enough to whisper about instead of speak of directly. I did not sleep well. Somewhere around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps in the hall, unhurried, and then nothing, and I lay very still and let myself believe, for the length of one long breath, that someone was making sure the house was safe before they let themselves rest. Morning came in the color of gray silk through curtains I hadn't thought to close, and it brought with it the first proof that I had stepped into a world with an entirely different set of physics than the one I'd left behind. Marta had laid out clothes on the chair by the door, plain, well-made, nothing that announced itself, the kind of quiet expensive I had only ever seen from the wrong side of a dining room. A note sat folded on top, in handwriting so precise it looked typeset. Breakfast at 8. Don't be late. Bram hates waiting. I found the kitchen by scent before I found it by sight, coffee and something baking, and Thea was already at the table with a folder open in front of her, and reading glasses I would not have guessed she needed, both of which vanished the instant she heard me in the doorway. "Sit," she said, and then, unexpectedly, "Did you sleep?" "Not much. Good instinct," she said, which was such a strange thing to say to someone about their insomnia that I almost laughed. "Means you're paying attention." She closed the folder before I could see what was in it, though I caught the edge of a photograph, a man's face, before it disappeared. "You'll stay here until we know who poured that wine. I have people combing through every hand that touched a bottle last night. In the meantime, you don't go anywhere without Bram or without me. Not the grocery store, not your own apartment, nowhere. That's not a life," I said, and immediately wished I'd swallowed it, because her eyes came up sharp. "It's a life that continues," she said. "The alternative doesn't." She studied me a moment, something calculating and underneath the calculation, almost curious. "What did you study before you left school?" "Specifically, toxicology. Mostly, I wanted to work in a compounding pharmacy. I liked the precision of it. One measurement wrong and everything changes. I turned my coffee cup a quarter turn, an old nervous habit. My mother got sick the same semester I would have finished my clinical rotations. After that, it didn't matter what I wanted. What was wrong with her? Ovarian cancer. Stage 4 by the time anyone caught it, because she waited to see a doctor until the pain stopped being ignorable, because doctors cost money we didn't have. I said it plainly. The way I had learned to say it after enough repetitions had worn the rawest edges smooth. I worked 3 jobs the last year. This was the best paying one, so it's the one I kept after. Something crossed her face I hadn't seen there yet. Not pity, which I would have hated, but a kind of recognition. The particular stillness of someone measuring another person's grief against their own and finding it fit. My mother built this family on the principle that love is leverage and control is the only real inheritance worth passing down, she said, quiet enough that I understood I was being given something, not just told something. She was very good at being right about the wrong things. I don't talk about her. I'm telling you so you understand why I don't extend trust easily. It was never modeled for me. I wasn't going to ask, I said. I know, she said. That's why I told you. The moment held a beat too long, charged in a way I didn't have language for yet. And then Bram appeared in the doorway with his phone already extended toward her, his face grim in a way that ended whatever had been building between us before it could finish forming. "Sommelier's missing," he said. "Didn't show for his shift this morning. His apartment's cleared out." The A's face closed like a door. "Then someone got to him before we could," she said, rising, the reading glasses forgotten on the table, the folder tucked under her arm. "Rue, stay close today." It wasn't a request, and for the first time since I'd walked into that private room at the Amaranth, I found I didn't want it to be one. The sommelier's disappearance set the house into a different gear entirely. One I felt in the way footsteps quickened down the hall, and phones rang low and urgent behind closed doors, and it was 2 days before Thea slowed down enough to look at me like a person again, instead of a variable in a security calculation. I spent those 2 days learning the shape of her world in fragments, the way every man in the house deferred to her without being asked, the way Marta hummed while she cooked as though nothing in the world could touch her kitchen, the way a framed photograph on the second-floor landing showed a woman I didn't recognize, dark-haired and laughing, that no one in the house ever mentioned, and everyone in the house carefully avoided looking at directly. I asked Nadia about it once over a phone call Bram monitored from 4 feet away, without pretending not to. Everyone in this city knows about Yelena Castellan, Nadia said, dropping her voice even though she was the one 3 miles away in safety. She died, what, 3 years ago? 4? Some kind of poisoning, at a family dinner. They never caught who did it. People say it's the only time anyone's ever seen the widow cry in public, and it was at the funeral, and only for about 4 seconds before she put it away and never let it back out again. I did not need Nadia to draw the rest of the line for me. I had swapped a poisoned glass 3 nights ago in the same restaurant this woman used for family business, and somewhere in this house was a room no one entered, and a photograph no one discussed, and a grief with the exact shape of the fear I had watched cross Thea's face when Bram said the word poison out loud. I found her that night in the garden, the wild, overgrown one beneath my window, sitting on a stone bench with a glass of something dark untouched beside her. She didn't look up when I approached, though I was certain she'd heard me coming from the far end of the hall. "You know about Yelena now?" she said. Not a question. Nadia mentioned her. I should have told you myself. Thea turned the glass a slow quarter turn without drinking from it, the same nervous gesture I'd caught myself doing at breakfast, and I wondered, absurdly, if we'd traded habits without meaning to. She was my wife. We were married 4 years. Someone put foxglove extract in a decanter meant for the head of the table, and it was meant for me, and she drank from the wrong glass because we'd swapped seats an hour earlier as a joke. Her voice did not break. It simply went very, very flat, the way ice goes flat right before it cracks. I have spent 3 years hunting the person who did it, and I have found nothing, not one name, not one thread. And now someone's tried again, I said. Same method. Same method, she agreed. Which means either the same person waited 3 years to try twice, or someone close to me learned exactly how the first attempt worked and decided it was worth repeating. She looked at me then, finally, and the cold precision I'd come to expect from her had cracked just enough to show something raw underneath it. You didn't just save my life at that table, Rue. You may be the only person alive who can prove whether this is the same hand or a copy of it. I'd need to see whatever's left of the original case, I said. Toxicology reports, anything they kept. If it's foxglove both times, there'll be signatures in how it was prepared, concentration, delivery method, masking agent. People don't change their methods much once they've found one that works. It's like handwriting. Something in her expression shifted, sharpened, focused entirely on me in a way that made the back of my neck warm, despite the cool night air. You could read that. I think so. I'd need time. And I'd need the files. Then you'll have both, she said, and rose from the bench, close enough now that her scent settled over me fully for the first time. Cedar gone dark with smoke, and beneath it, faint, something that might have been grief held so long it had become simply part of how she smelled. Tomorrow, tonight, I only wanted to sit somewhere that wasn't full of people asking me what I intend to do about it. She studied me a moment longer than the conversation required. You don't ask me that. Why? Because I don't think you know yet, I said honestly. And I don't think you need one more person pretending certainty at you until you've had a minute to just be angry. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and the garden held its breath around us, crickets and the far-off hush of traffic beyond the wall, and then she reached out and, with a care that startled me more than any of the danger of the last 3 days had, tucked a piece of hair behind my ear that had come loose from its pin. "Tell me to stop," she said, low, "and I will." "Don't stop," I said, before I'd fully decided to say anything at all, and her hand stayed where it was, warm against my jaw, neither of us moving for a long moment that held every unspoken thing between us like water right at the lip of a glass, not yet spilling. "Not tonight," she said finally, and there was real regret in it, not rejection. Not while someone in my own house might have poisoned me twice. I won't start something I can't protect. She stepped back, and the cold night air rushed in where her warmth had been. But I wanted you to know, it isn't nothing. Whatever this is, it isn't nothing, I agreed, and we stood there a moment longer in the dark garden, two women who had each spent years learning to want nothing out loud. Both of us, for the first time in longer than either would admit, wanting something anyway. The files came the next morning in a locked case, Bram carried into the study like it weighed more than its actual contents, and Thea set them in front of me with the particular tension of a woman handing over the one wound she'd never let anyone examine. I worked through them for 6 straight hours, Marta bringing tea I mostly let go cold, until the numbers started arranging themselves the way they used to in lecture halls, patterns emerging from noise, the way a face emerges from static once you've stared at it long enough. It's the same hand, I said finally, and Thea, who had been pretending to read something at the far end of the room for the last hour without turning a single page, went very still. The masking agent's identical, rosewater over foxglove, same ratio almost to the decimal. Whoever did this 3 years ago did it again 3 nights ago. That's not a copycat. Copycats guess. This person knew the exact formula, which means they either did it the first time, or they were close enough to someone who did to learn it precisely. Close enough, Thea repeated, and something in her voice had gone dangerously quiet. There were 6 people at that dinner 3 years ago. 5 of them are dead, retired, or out of the country. One of them isn't. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. I watched it arrive behind her eyes like weather rolling in off the water, and I watched her decide, in real time, not to speak it until she was certain. Because a woman like Thea Castellan did not accuse family without proof, not even the family she'd clearly begun, in the silence of that study, to suspect completely. Garrick, she said finally, so quietly it was almost not a word at all. He poured the wine 3 years ago. He recommended the sommelier who vanished 2 nights ago. Her jaw tightened, the muscle there flexing once. Hard, he's my cousin. He sat at my right hand since I was 22 years old. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing and let the silence hold the shape of a betrayal too large, yet to be spoken fully into the room, and outside the study window the light had gone from gray to gold without either of us noticing the hours pass. The days that followed moved at 2 speeds at once, slow in the house, where Thea gave nothing away in front of anyone including, I suspected, Bram, and fast underneath, where I could feel her quietly rerouting information, quietly testing Garrick with small lies to see which ones came back to her from the wrong direction. I stayed close to her the way she'd asked, learned the rooms of the house the way I'd once learned compound structures, and found myself, against every instinct I had built over 6 years of staying small, letting myself be seen by her in the small hours when the house had gone quiet and it was only the 2 of us in the kitchen, her making tea badly, me correcting the water temperature without thinking, both of us laughing quietly enough not to wake anyone, the first real laughter I'd let out of my chest in longer than I wanted to count. It was on the 9th night that the fire alarm at my old apartment building went off at 2 in the morning, and Bram woke the house with the news that it hadn't been an accident, that someone had gone through the 3rd floor with an accelerant and a very specific interest in Unit 3C, which had been mine until 9 days ago, and which, thank God, was empty of me and everything I owned that mattered, because I hadn't gone back for any of it. "They're looking for you," Thea said, standing in my doorway at 2:30 in a robe she hadn't bothered to tie properly, her hair loose for the first time since I'd known her, and something about seeing her undone like that, urgent and human and afraid for me specifically, cracked something open in my chest that I hadn't let anyone near in years. Garrick knows you identified the pattern. He knows what you are to this now. I'm not anything to this, I started. Out of habit, out of 6 years of making myself smaller than the truth. You're the only witness who can put his method in a courtroom, she said, closing the distance between us. And you are the only person who has made me want something for myself in 3 years, instead of only wanting justice for someone I already lost. Her hand came up to my face again, the same careful weight as the garden, and this time there was no pulling back in it. Only the question, asked with her whole body instead of her words. Tell me to stop. Don't, I said, and this time neither of us waited for morning. She kissed me slow, the way she did everything, deliberate and unhurried even with danger sitting 2 floors below, in the form of an armed man at every door. And I felt something in my chest that had been clenched tight since my mother's last breath finally, carefully, begin to loosen. When she pulled back, her forehead resting against mine, her breath uneven in a way I don't think she allowed herself often, she said, quiet enough that it felt like a vow rather than a sentence, nothing gets past my door without my knowing. Not anymore. Not you, not Garrick. Not anyone who thinks they can take something from me twice. I believed her completely. It would be one of the last times, for a long while, that I believed anything so completely again. The 2 weeks that followed were the gentlest of my life, and I would come to understand, much later, that the story always builds its softest rooms right before it tears them down. Thea taught me the names of the trees in the overgrown garden, absurdly precise about it, the way she was precise about everything, and I taught her, in exchange, that chamomile steeped 2 hot turns bitter, that rue should never touch an open wound, no matter how old the folklore claimed it healed one, that my mother used to hum a particular 3-note tune every time she put the kettle on, an old song with no name I ever learned, and that I hadn't heard it hummed by anyone since the funeral and missed it more than almost anything else about her. Thea listened to all of it the way she listened to intelligence reports, absorbing every detail like it might matter later, and I did not yet understand how much of what I told her in those quiet weeks she was quietly filing away to use in exactly the way I would have wanted, if I'd known to want it. I told her, once, lying in the dark with her arm heavy and warm across my waist, that I had never once in my life seen the ocean. My mother had promised we'd go. Someday, after the treatments worked, after the money came back, someday that never arrived before she did. Thea went very still when I said it, the particular stillness she reserved for things she intended to remember. "We'll go," she said, "when this is finished. I'll take you." "You don't have to promise things like that." "I don't promise things I don't intend to keep," she said, and something about the flatness of it, the total lack of romance in how she said something so tender, made me believe her more than any poetry could have. We found Garrick's second attempt not through my knowledge of poison, but through Bram's quiet, dogged work, a courier who'd been paid in cash to deliver a package to a woman named Odalys Wren, head of a rival syndicate that had been circling Castellan territory for 2 years without ever quite finding an opening. The package contained a full accounting of Thea's security rotations, her routes, her safe houses. Garrick's handwriting was on the enclosed note, disguised badly enough that Bram recognized it within minutes. "He's not just working with her," Thea said, staring at the note with a stillness that had gone past cold into something closer to grief. "He's been feeding her everything for months, maybe longer. Maybe since Yelena. We have proof now," I said. "We can move on him. Proof I can show my own people, not proof I can show a courtroom," she said, he'll deny it, and half the men in this house have known him 20 years longer than they've known you. I need something that can't be argued with. I need him to confess, or I need forensic evidence tying him directly to both poisonings, something even his oldest friends can't explain away. Then, let me finish the analysis, I said. Give me another day with the original case file and a sample from what's left of the sommelier's kit, if your people found it. If the masking compound was custom mixed, there'll be a supplier trail. That's not circumstantial. That's a paper chain leading straight to whoever bought the ingredients. She looked at me for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind her eyes. You keep doing this, she said, handing me the one thing I actually need. I'm good at exactly one thing, I said. Might as well be useful with it. You're good at more than one thing, she said low, and reached for me again, and for one more night. We let ourselves believe there was time enough left to finish that sentence properly. There wasn't. I woke the next morning to an empty house and a note in Marta's shaking handwriting saying Thea had been called away before dawn to an emergency meeting of family heads called by Garrick himself, framed as a show of unity against Odalus Wren's growing aggression. I should have understood immediately what it was. Instead, I spent the morning in the study finishing the analysis I'd promised, tracing the masking compound to a supplier 3 states away, building exactly the kind of undeniable paper trail Thea had asked for, feeling, for the first time in this entire ordeal, genuinely useful instead of merely protected. I was still bent over the files when the study door opened, and it wasn't Bram, and it wasn't Thea. It was Garrick. I recognized him from the photograph I'd glimpsed in Thea's folder that first morning, older now, silver at the temples, dressed with the particular expensive carelessness of a man who had never once doubted his own charm. He smiled at me the way he must have smiled at Yelena Castellan across a dinner table, warm and easy and entirely professionally false. You're the waitress, he said, closing the door behind him with a soft click that landed in my chest like a slamming one. Rue, was it? Thea speaks very highly of you. Says you have quite the nose. You should leave, I said, already calculating the distance to the door, the window, anything, and finding all of it too far. I will, he said pleasantly, and you're coming with me, because Thea is currently 3 hours away being told very convincingly that you were never who you claimed to be, that the poisoning at the Amaranth was staged by you and Odalus Wren together. To buy yourself a place inside this family. I've spent 2 weeks building that story. It's a very good story. People believe good stories, Rue, especially when the alternative is believing that someone they trusted for 20 years did something unforgivable. My stomach dropped through the floor. She won't believe that. She might not want to, he agreed, stepping closer. And I saw, finally, the flash of something under the pleasant mask, something that had been there the whole time, patient and hungry and entirely without conscience. But doubt doesn't need belief to work. It only needs a few hours to breathe. And by the time she's finished doubting, you and I will be somewhere she'll never think to look, and I'll have exactly the leverage I need to finish what I started 3 years ago. He reached for my arm. I threw the nearest thing I could reach, a heavy glass paperweight from the desk, hard enough to catch him across the temple, and for one wild second I thought I might actually make it to the door. I didn't. 2 more men came in behind him before I'd crossed half the room, and the last thing I remembered clearly was a cloth pressed hard over my mouth, chemical and sweet, and my own mind, even as the room went dark at the edges, cataloging it out of pure old habit. Chloroform, poorly diluted. I'd know the smell of it now for the rest of my life. I woke on concrete, in a room with one high window painted over black, my wrists zip-tied in front of me and my head pounding in time with my pulse. It took me a long, disoriented moment to remember why I was there, and then it arrived all at once. Garrick's face, his voice, the study door clicking shut. And beneath the fear came something else, something colder and more useful, the smell of the room itself. Bleach, heavy and recent, covering something underneath it that hadn't quite been erased. Diesel, from somewhere close, maybe a garage. And faint, almost gone, the ghost of the same rosewater masking agent I'd smelled twice now in wine that shouldn't have carried it. Which meant, whatever else this room was, it had recently held the supplies for exactly the kind of poisoning Garrick had already tried on Thea twice. I was in his workshop. I was in the place where all of it had started. I heard voices through the door. One of them, Garrick's, low and satisfied, and another I didn't recognize. And I understood, listening to the particular cadence of a woman used to giving orders, that Odalys Wren had come to see her investment in person. "She's the loose thread," Odalys was saying, her voice carrying easily through the thin door, cultured, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never once had to raise it to be obeyed. Kill her quietly, and Thea spends the next year grieving instead of hunting. That buys us everything we need. Not yet, Garrick said. Thea's smart enough to want proof of life first, if she's smart enough to survive the story I've told her. We use the girl as leverage until the transition's finished. After that, she's yours to handle however you like. Their footsteps retreated, a door somewhere farther off closing, and I was alone in the dark with a pounding skull and zip-tied wrists and the absolute, terrifying certainty that Thea, wherever she was, believed at least one version of a lie that painted me as the architect of my own kidnapping. I did not let myself cry. I let myself think instead, because thinking was the one thing I had ever been reliably good at. And I cataloged the room by smell and by sound, the way I'd once cataloged compounds in a lecture hall, building a map in the dark out of nothing but attention, because attention, I had learned a long time ago, refilling water glasses at a table where no one remembered my name, was the only kind of power I had ever been allowed to keep. Thea found me by scent, though she would not tell me that until much later, would not admit that 3 years of hunting a ghost had trained her to track the exact chemical signature of the compound that had killed her wife. And that the moment Bram's people traced a bulk foxglove purchase to a warehouse 2 districts over, she had known, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof, and everything to do with grief sharpened into instinct, that it was the same place, and that I was in it. I heard the door go down before I saw her, a controlled violence of sound, boots and shouting, and one gunshot, close, that stopped my heart entirely until I understood it hadn't been aimed at me. Then the door of my room burst inward, and she was there, and the look on her face when she saw me tied to a chair in the dark was not the cold, controlled fury of the Castellan widow the city whispered about. It was something rawer than that, something that looked, for one unguarded second, exactly like the 4 seconds of grief Nadia had described at Yelena's funeral, except this time it broke across her face and did not fully close again. "You're alive," she said, crossing the room in 3 strides, cutting the ties from my wrists with a knife I hadn't seen her carrying, her hands shaking, actually shaking, for the first time since I'd known her. "I didn't do what he told you I did," I said, the words tumbling out before anything else could. "I know," she said, fierce, cupping my face in both hands. I knew within an hour. Garrick's story had a hole in it he didn't think I'd find, and I tore the rest of it apart looking for you. Her thumb brushed along my cheekbone, checking, I realized, for injury, cataloging me the way I'd cataloged the room, attention as the only currency either of us had ever fully trusted. I am so sorry it took me this long. Behind her, through the open door, I heard Bram's voice, sharp with command, and beneath it, unmistakably, Garrick's, no longer smooth, no longer charming, pleading in the particular high register of a man who has just understood that every door out of a room has closed at once. "Odalys," I said. "She's here too." I heard her voice. She was going to have him kill me once the transition finished. Thea's face went, for just a moment, terrifyingly still. Then, she rose, pulling me up with her, one arm locking around my waist to keep me steady on legs that hadn't fully remembered how to hold weight. Then she made the mistake of being in the same building as both of us, she said, and led me out into the hallway, where Garrick knelt on the concrete with Bram's gun leveled at the back of his skull and every ounce of his charm finally, completely stripped away. Thea stopped in front of him, and the silence that followed held longer than I expected, long enough that I felt her hand tighten on my waist, long enough that I understood she was deciding, in real time, exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend on the ending this moment offered her. "You killed Yelena," she said, quiet. And it was not a question either. "She wasn't supposed to drink from that glass," Garrick said, and something in his voice cracked, finally, 3 years of careful performance collapsing into something small and ugly. "It was supposed to be you. It was always supposed to be you. You were never going to share this family the way your mother promised me you would, and I watched you inherit everything I'd spent 20 years earning a place beside. Stop talking," Thea said. And he did, immediately, some old animal instinct in him still recognizing her authority even now. She looked at Bram's gun, at the back of Garrick's bowed head, and I watched her hand flex once at her side, watched the full weight of 3 years of grief gather itself behind her eyes, and I understood, with total clarity, that she was one word away from ending this the way the city expected the Castellan widow to end things. "Thea," I said, quiet, stepping close enough that only she would hear it. "Don't. Not like this. Not in the dark where no one sees what he did to Yelena, to you, to this whole family. Let them all see it. Let it cost him everything in the light, in front of every person who ever called him loyal. That's worse for him than a bullet, and it's better for you. You don't have to carry this the way you carried her death. Let the truth carry it instead." She looked at me for a long, taut moment, and I watched something in her. Not the fury. The fury didn't leave, but the part of her that had been ready to become, in that one instant, exactly the kind of monster her mother had raised her to be, step back from the edge. "Take him," she said to Bram, her voice steady again, cold and exact. "Alive, Odalys too, wherever she's hiding in this building." Everyone answers for this in front of the full commission. Every family head in this city is going to hear exactly what he did, and exactly who stopped him twice. Bram hauled Garrick to his feet, and somewhere down the corridor came the sound of a struggle, brief and one-sided, ending in Odalys Wren's cultured voice, rising in outrage as 2 of Thea's men marched her out in restraints, her composure cracking for the first time since I'd overheard her calm, unhurried order to have me killed once I was no longer useful. Thea turned to me then, in the middle of a warehouse hallway that smelled of gun oil and bleach, and underneath everything, faintly, still, of rosewater, and pressed her forehead to mine the way she had on the night everything between us had finally, truly begun. "I am never letting anything get that close to you again," she said, low, fierce, a vow rather than a promise. "Not while I have breath in me." The full commission convened 4 nights later in a ballroom I had only ever imagined from the outside of magazine pages. Every family head in the city gathered under chandeliers that threw gold light over marble the color of old bone, and I stood at Thea's side in a dress Marta had insisted on, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like a person the room might actually see, rather than look through. Garrick knelt in the center of the floor, stripped of the easy charm that had carried him through 20 years of trusted proximity, and Odalys Wren stood apart from him, composed even now, though her composure did nothing to soften the murmur that ran through the gathered heads when the evidence was laid before them, one careful piece at a time. I gave my testimony without flinching, because I had spent 6 years learning how to be steady in rooms that did not want me in them, and this room, for all its danger, wanted exactly what I had to give. I walked the assembled families through the masking compound, the ratio identical across 3 years and 2 attempts. The supplier trail leading directly to an account Garrick had never quite managed to fully hide. I explained it the way I once explained compounds to a lecture hall that had believed, back then, that I had a future in exactly this kind of precision, and when I finished, the room was silent in a way I recognized. The particular silence of people forced to look directly at something they had spent years choosing not to see. 3 years ago, Thea said, into that silence, her voice carrying without needing to rise, this family lost Yelena Castellan to a man who called himself loyal to my face for 20 years while selling my life to whoever would pay for it. I could not prove it then. I can prove it now. Because a woman this room dismissed as nobody, a woman half of you walked past without learning her name, refused to let a lie stand between justice and the people who deserved it. She turned, and every eye in the room followed the movement, landing, finally, fully, on me. Rue Calloway saved my life twice. Once with a glass of wine, and once with the truth, when every easier story would have let her walk away and let someone else carry the weight of proving it. I will not stand in a room and let anyone here pretend she is beneath notice ever again. The silence that followed broke into something else entirely. A murmur of assent, heads bowing in a gesture I would learn, was as close to an apology as this world offered, and I felt, for the first time since I was 19 years old and disappearing quietly into a hospital corridor, entirely, completely seen. Garrick was stripped of every title, every claim, every protection the family name had ever extended him, and remanded to authorities with enough evidence attached to guarantee he would not see the outside of a cell for the remainder of his life. Odalys Wren's alliance collapsed within the week, her own people abandoning her the instant her exposure made her more liability than asset, her territory absorbed and her name spoken, from then on, only as a cautionary tale about what happens to ambition unmoored from loyalty. When the room finally emptied, Thea took my hand in front of everyone still lingering near the doors, unhurried, deliberate, exactly the way she did everything, and did not let go. "Ask me with your words," she said quietly, once we were finally blessedly alone in the hall outside the ballroom, echoing back to me, though I don't think she knew it, the exact shape of every consent I had ever given her. "I love you," I said, because it was the truest sentence I had, simpler than anything I'd said in that ballroom about compounds and ratios and proof. I have for weeks. I just didn't think I was allowed to say it first. "You're allowed to say anything you want first," she said, and kissed me there in the empty hall, slow and certain, both of us finally, fully unguarded, and when she pulled back her hand came up to my throat, resting there with a question in her palm that needed no words at all. "Tell me to stop," she said, one final time, the ritual between us worn smooth now with repetition and trust. "Don't stop," I said, "not ever." And so, with witnesses only in the empty marble hall and the gold light of a chandelier neither of us bothered to look up at, she claimed me the way the old bond rights required, gentle where instinct might have asked for force. Her mouth at my throat and her hands steady despite everything in her that must have wanted, after 3 years of restraint, to simply hold on. It did not hurt the way I'd once heard it described. It felt like a door finally, fully opening, the bond settling into place between us warm and total, and I felt her feel me back through it for the first time, grief and relief and a fierce, uncomplicated joy that I understood, suddenly, had been building in her since the exact moment I set a fresh glass down at table 9 and changed both our lives without meaning to. A year had passed since that night in the marble hall, and I stood now in a garden that no longer looked wild or forgotten, chamomile and rue growing in careful rows along a stone path Thea had commissioned the same week Garrick's sentencing was finalized, insisting, when I protested the expense, that a woman who had saved her life with her nose for herbs deserved a garden worthy of it. The dented tin that had once held my mother's last dried remnants of chamomile and rue sat now in a glass case on the kitchen windowsill, empty and retired, a small plaque beneath it in Marta's careful hand that simply read the beginning. Beside it sat a new tin, silver instead of dented, kept always full. The wedding had been small, exactly as I'd asked for, held in this same garden under an evening sky, gone the particular gold that only happens in late summer, Bram standing as witness on Thea's side, with an expression so uncharacteristically soft that Nadia, standing as mine, had to elbow me to keep from laughing during the vows. Bram had given a short toast afterward, gruff and clearly uncomfortable with sentiment that nonetheless landed harder than any speech I'd heard before or since. In 15 years, he'd said, he had never once seen Thea Castellan wait for anyone. He'd watched her wait an entire evening at that warehouse door for word that I was alive, and he understood, in that waiting, exactly what kind of woman I was, long before either of us said it plainly. Denny Cole, who had once told me in front of a full dining room that I should smile more if I wanted to be remembered, had been quietly fired from the Amaranth the same month Garrick's trial concluded, after an internal review turned up years of skimming from the till that had somehow never been investigated while he was busy criticizing the waitstaff for smiling too little. I did not orchestrate it. I did not need to. The truth, once it started surfacing in that city, seemed to have decided it was done staying buried anywhere. We had gone to the ocean the month after the wedding, exactly as Thea had promised in the dark of a house under siege, and I had stood at the edge of water I had never once seen with my own eyes, and cried in a way I hadn't let myself since my mother's funeral, not from grief this time, but from the sheer, overwhelming fact of being alive to see it, with someone beside me who had learned, patiently, precisely, every small wish I had ever mentioned only once, and never expected to be remembered. Tonight, the garden held only the two of us, morning light not yet arrived, but close, the particular blue hour when the whole world seems to be holding its breath before color returns to it. Thea sat beside me on the same stone bench where she had once told me about Yelena, her hand resting easy over mine, and somewhere in the house behind us, Marta was already humming, low and unhurried, a 3-note tune with no name that I had once thought I would never hear again, and that Thea, in the quiet months after the wedding, had gone to considerable trouble to learn from an old recording of my mother's, made once, years ago, on a phone I still had, and had taught, patiently, to a woman who could not carry a tune to save her life. "You're doing the thing again," Thea said, low, watching the sky. "Counting something." "Seconds," I admitted, smiling, old habit. "Still nervous?" "No," I said, and meant it fully, for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Just grateful. I'm counting how many good ones we've had." She turned my hand over in hers, pressed her mouth once, gently to my palm, the same steady gesture she used for everything that mattered to her. "There will be more than either of us can count," she said, starting now, and the sun came up over the garden exactly as she said it. Gold light spilling first across the rue plants, then across the silver tin on the windowsill. Then across the two of us, sitting together in the kind of quiet I had once mistaken for invisibility, and now understood, finally, completely, as peace. I had spent 6 years believing that being overlooked was simply the shape safety took for a woman with nothing left to lose. It took one poisoned glass, switched in silence by hands no one thought to watch, to teach me the truth of it, instead, that the quietest people in any room are often the ones paying the closest attention, and that being truly seen, once, by the right person, can undo a lifetime of being looked past. Some rescues arrive with sirens. Ours arrived with a smell no one else noticed, and a woman brave enough to trust it. The end.